wind came first, a low moan that slid through the canyons like a grieving spirit. It carried the grit of the sun-scorched earth, a fine red powder that tasted of iron and endless desolation. In the fledgling town of Redemption, the wind was a constant sermon on the fragility of things of wood, of will of life itself. On this day, it was a prophet of chaos. The sky had turned a bruised ochre, the sun a tarnished coin, swallowed by the churning dust. Doors slammed shut. Windows were shuttered. The world outside the Redemption Bank became a maelstrom of screaming air and stinging sand. Inside, the silence was a held breath. Ethan Ward stood at the teller's cage, his calloused hands resting on the worn oak counter. He was a man shaped by silence and toil, his face a landscape of quiet sorrows. The dust storm was an inconvenience, delaying his return to the farm, to the suffocating quiet of the house he had once shared with Margaret. He was here to deposit the meager proceeds from his harvest, a ritual that felt more like an offering to a ghost than a financial transaction. That was when the bank's doors burst inward, not with the force of the wind, but with the cold, deliberate violence of men. 3 figures filled the doorway, their long dusters whipping around them like tormented specters. They were silhouettes against the swirling ochre light, their faces obscured by bandanas. The scent of ozone gunpowder and stale sweat flooded the small room. The third man, the last to enter, was different. He wore no mask. He let the door swing shut behind him, the latch clicking with an unnerving finality that severed the bank from the outside world. He was tall and unnaturally still, his black coat immaculate despite the storm. A face that might have been handsome was marred by an absence of warmth, his eyes the color of a winter sky over a frozen lake. He surveyed the room, the terrified teller, the 2 customers cowering on the floor, and finally Ethan. A faint, knowing smile touched his lips. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice was a surprise, not the rough bark of a common outlaw, but a cultured, almost melodic baritone that cut through the howl of the wind. "This is a reallocation of assets. Your cooperation will ensure it remains a swift and bloodless affair." His men moved with brutal efficiency. One vaulted the counter, stuffing cash into a canvas sack. The other kept his pistol trained on the huddled customers. But their leader, the man in the black coat, did not move toward the money. He walked slowly, deliberately across the floorboards, his spurs ringing a soft, predatory rhythm. He stopped directly in front of Ethan. "Ethan Ward," he said, the name a statement, not a question. Ethan's blood ran cold. He was a farmer, a quiet man who kept to himself. No one in Redemption knew the man he used to be. No one should have known his name with such chilling familiarity. He said nothing, his gaze locked on the stranger. The man's smile widened, a bloodless, predatory thing. "You have something that belongs to me. A debt. But I will settle for a down payment." His eyes flickered to the thin silver chain around Ethan's neck, tucked beneath his shirt. Before Ethan could react, the man's hand shot out impossibly fast. He ripped the chain from Ethan's neck, the metal snapping with a sharp ping. In his gloved palm lay a small silver locket tarnished with age and love. A raw, guttural sound escaped Ethan's throat. No, the locket was all he had left of her. Inside, behind a tiny hinged frame, was the last portrait of Margaret, her smile a beacon in the lonely wilderness of his memory. The man, Silas Blackwood, clicked open the locket. He stared at the miniature portrait, his expression unreadable. "Such a devoted wife," he murmured, his voice laced with a venomous irony. He snapped it shut. A shame her loyalty was so misplaced. He slipped the locket into his waistcoat pocket, a deliberate, final gesture. It wasn't a robbery. It was a violation, a calculated amputation of his soul. "Give it back," Ethan's voice was a low growl, the quiet farmer momentarily consumed by the ghost of a deadlier man. Blackwood simply chuckled, a dry rustling sound. "Justice, Mr. Ward, is a matter of perspective. You had yours. Now I shall have mine." He turned his men, already backing toward the door with their loot. The wind howled a chorus to the chaos. This is only the beginning. With that, they were gone, swallowed by the red storm as quickly as they had appeared. The bank was left in a state of ringing silence, the air thick with dust and the metallic tang of fear. The other customers sobbed quietly. The teller was frozen in shock. But Ethan Ward saw nothing, heard nothing. He felt only the raw, empty space on his chest where the locket used to rest, a cold spot that mirrored the cavernous void in his life. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had just been unleashed within him. Blackwood had not just stolen a piece of silver. He had stolen a memory. He had stolen a wife all over again. And in that moment, the quiet farmer died, and the man he had tried to bury in the dust of redemption began to stir. The storm passed as twilight bled across the desert, leaving the world washed in hues of indigo and violet. Redemption emerged from its shelter, shaking off the red dust like a wet dog. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of rain that had fallen miles away. For Ethan, the calm was a mockery. His world remained a tempest. He did not speak to Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary eyes had seen too much to be surprised by anything, even a bank robbery, in broad daylight. He simply nodded when Brody asked if he was unharmed, the lie heavy in his throat. He was a walking wound. The ride back to his farm was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every butte silhouetted against the dying light, every gnarled juniper reminded him of Margaret. They had built this life together, a quiet sanctuary, meant to wall off the past. He had promised her peace, a life where the only shots fired were at rattlesnakes and coyotes. He had failed. The past had found him. His farmhouse stood dark and silent, a monument to his loss. For 2 years since the wasting sickness had taken her, it had been a house, not a home. Now it felt like a tomb. He lit a single lantern, its golden glow doing little to push back the oppressive shadows that clung to the corners of every room. He sat at the rough-hewn kitchen table, Margaret's empty chair across from him, and let the silence press in. Who was Silas Blackwood? The name was a key turning a lock in a part of his mind he had sealed shut years ago. He let his memory drift back past the fields and the fences, past the wedding vows and the promises, to a time of gun smoke and blood. To a muddy street in a forgotten town called Jericho's Folly. A reckless shootout. A young man arrogant and fast who had drawn on him over a card game. Ethan had been faster. It was a clean kill, but it had felt dirty, pointless. The young man had a brother, he recalled someone saying. A quieter, colder brother who had watched from the shadows of a livery stable, his eyes burning with a hatred that was patient and absolute. A name surfaced from the depths of that memory. Thomas Blackwood. Silas Blackwood. The brother. The realization struck Ethan not with the force of a thunderclap, but with the cold, creeping dread of a fever. This wasn't about money. This was a vendetta nursed for a decade, honed to a razor's edge. Blackwood wasn't just a robber. He was a reaper, and he had come to harvest Ethan's soul. The methodical way he and his gang had been operating in the region for months suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. They weren't just grabbing what they could. They were strangling the territory, buying up water rights, forcing ranchers off their land, isolating redemption, isolating him. Driven by a desperate, newly awakened energy, Ethan began to search the house. He had to know more. He had to find a weakness, a clue, anything. He started in their bedroom, the air still faintly scented with the lavender Margaret had kept in sachets. He ran his hands over the familiar contours of her dresser, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. Nothing. His search grew more frantic. He moved to the old roll-top desk in the parlor, pulling open drawers filled with farm ledgers and receipts. Then he found it. Tucked away at the very back of the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old seed catalogs, was a small leather-bound journal. Margaret's journal. He had not seen it in years, had forgotten it existed. His hands trembled as he opened it. Her elegant script filled the pages, a graceful dance of ink on paper. The early entries were filled with hope plans for the farm, descriptions of the desert wildflowers, loving words about the new life they were building. But as he turned the pages, the tone shifted. The entries grew shorter, more sporadic. The handwriting tighter, edged with fear. October 14th. One entry read, "A man came by today asking for work. He had cold eyes. He asked about Ethan, about where he came from. I sent him away, but I saw him watching the house from the ridgeline for hours. I did not tell E. He has enough ghosts." A few weeks later, Ethan's nightmares are worse. He calls out a name in his sleep, Jericho. I fear the past is not as buried as we hoped. A shadow hangs over this place. I can feel it. The words confirmed his dread. Blackwood had been watching them for a long time. Even before Margaret fell ill, the siege had begun. Ethan felt a surge of rage, hot and blinding, followed by a wave of crushing guilt. She had carried this fear alone, trying to protect him from the very demons he had brought to their door. He had to get the locket back. It was more than a memento now. It was a symbol of his failure, and reclaiming it was the only penance he could imagine. His path was clear. He couldn't wait for the law. This was a personal war declared long ago, and the first battle had just been lost. He would find Blackwood's camp. He would face him. The quiet farmer would have to be put to rest, and the gunslinger exhumed. He went to the old trunk at the foot of their bed. He lifted the lid, the scent of cedar and disuse rising to meet him. Beneath his spare wool blankets lay a worn leather gun belt, coiled like a sleeping snake. The Colt Peacemaker in its holster was dark and heavy, its metal cool to the touch. He hadn't held it in 8 years. It felt alien and yet terrifyingly familiar. As his fingers wrapped around the walnut grip, he felt a part of himself he thought long dead stir from its slumber. He was no longer just a farmer in a town called Redemption. He was a man with a debt to collect. The high desert was a different beast at night. Under the cold, indifferent gaze of a million stars, the familiar landscape transformed into a realm of sharp shadows and unseen things. Ethan rode east toward the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, a place where lawmen feared to tread, and outlaws carved out their kingdoms. He had spent the day gathering information, listening to the hushed whispers in the Redemption Saloon, piecing together fragments of rumor about Blackwood's operations. The trail led to a series of abandoned silver mines, honeycombed throughout the Dragoons. He rode with a singular focus, the rhythmic creak of his saddle leather, a counterpoint to the frantic beating of his own heart. The Colt was a heavy weight on his hip, a constant reminder of the line he was about to cross. This was a fool's errand, a solitary man against a small army. But the image of Blackwood's cruel smile as he pocketed the locket burned away all reason. He found the camp near dawn. It was nestled in a box canyon, the entrance cleverly masked by a rock slide. The smoke from a dying campfire gave them away, a thin gray finger pointing to the sky. He tethered his horse in a cluster of junipers and crept forward on foot, his movements fluid and silent, a predator's grace he hadn't used in years. The camp was larger than he'd anticipated. A dozen men were scattered around Mo, still wrapped in their bedrolls. A single guard sat slumped against a rock, his hat pulled low over his eyes, a rifle across his lap. Blackwood's tent was larger than the others set apart near the canyon wall. Ethan's plan was simple, reckless, and born of desperation. Get in, find the locket, and get out. He moved from shadow to shadow, his boots making no sound on the rocky ground. The sleeping guard was an easy obstacle. A sharp, precise blow to the base of the neck with the barrel of his pistol, and the man crumpled without a sound. He reached the flap of Blackwood's tent, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear the soft sound of rhythmic breathing from within. He drew his knife slit the canvas near the ground and slipped inside. The tent was Spartan, but organized. A cot, a small writing desk, and a locked chest. The locket had to be on Blackwood's person or in that chest. Blackwood lay on the cot, one arm flung over his face, breathing deeply. For a fleeting moment, Ethan considered ending it right there. A single swift motion with the knife. Justice. But it wouldn't be justice. It would be murder, and it wouldn't bring Margaret back or erase the stain of Jericho's folly. He needed the locket. He moved to the chest. The lock was crude. He inserted the tip of his knife, worked it for a moment, and felt the mechanism give with a soft click. He lifted the lid. Inside were maps, bundles of cash, and boxes of ammunition. No locket. A floorboard creaked behind him. Ethan spun around the Colt in his hand before he'd even registered the sound. Blackwood was standing not by the cot, but by the tent flap, a long-barreled Remington aimed squarely at Ethan's chest. Two of his men stood behind him, their expressions grim. "It had been a trap. I must confess, Mr. Ward, I'm disappointed." Blackwood said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I expected you to come, of course. But I thought you might bring the sheriff. To come alone. Is that bravery or foolishness?" "Where is it?" Ethan demanded, his voice low and tight. "Ah, the trinket." Blackwood smiled. He reached into his waistcoat and produced the silver locket, dangling it from his fingers. It's remarkable how much value a man can place on such a small object. It gives one leverage. Ethan's gaze was fixed on the locket, a tiny silver pendulum marking the seconds of his life running out. "Drop the gun, Ward," Blackwood said, his voice losing its pleasant veneer, replaced by cold steel. "Or the next thing you see will be your wife's face shattering as the bullet passes through it." The choice was no choice at all. The Colt felt impossibly heavy. With a feeling of profound defeat, Ethan let it fall to the dirt floor. Blackwood's men were on him in an instant, their fists and boots a brutal percussive storm. Pain exploded in his head, his ribs, his gut. He fought back with a feral desperation, but it was 2 against 1, and his movements were sluggish, rusted by years of peace. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into blackness was Blackwood looking down at him, his face a mask of cold satisfaction and the silver locket glinting in the faint morning light, before he tucked it safely away. He woke to the searing pain of the midday sun. They had left him in the desert, miles from the canyon. His horse was gone, his canteen was empty. He was beaten, bruised, and stripped of his gun. They had left him to the buzzards and the heat. He staggered to his feet, his body screaming in protest. Every direction was an endless expanse of sun-scorched earth where the heat shimmered like a phantom lake. He had no idea which way redemption lay. He chose a direction and began to walk a shuffling, agonizing gait. Hours bled into one another. His thirst was a living thing, a fire in his throat. The sun was a hammer beating down on him without mercy. He stumbled and fell, his face pressing into the hot sand. Despair began to settle in a cold, heavy blanket. He thought he was hallucinating when he saw it, the collapsed roofline of a familiar structure on the horizon. His old homestead. The first property he and Margaret had owned closer to the mountains, abandoned years ago when they bought the better plot of land nearer to town. It was miles from where he thought he was, but it was a landmark. It was shelter. With the last of his strength, he clawed his way across the cracked earth, his mind fixed on that single point of hope. He collapsed through the rotted doorway as the sun began to set his body a symphony of pain. The small one-room cabin was filled with dust and decay, but it was out of the sun. He found no water. But as he searched frantically, his hands scrabbling in the dark corners, his fingers brushed against a loose floorboard. Driven by a vague, desperate curiosity, he pried it up. Beneath it, in a small, concealed hollow, sat a heavy wooden crate bound in oilcloth and sealed with wax. He didn't recognize it. It must have been Margaret's. Something she had hidden here in the place where their life together had begun. He tore at the oilcloth, his fingers raw and bleeding. He broke the wax seal and lifted the heavy lid. The inside was packed with dirt and excelsior. Nestled within were dozens of glass jars, and inside the jars, suspended in a dark, viscous fluid, were things. They looked like seed pods or cocoons, dark brown and oval-shaped, covered in tiny thorn-like protrusions. As he lifted one of the jars for a closer look, it slipped from his trembling, clumsy fingers and shattered on the floor. The fluid soaked into the dry wood. Several of the thorny pods rolled out. Without thinking, he reached down to pick them up. A sharp, piercing pain shot through the palm of his hand as the tiny thorns pricked his skin. He swore, dropping the pods. They were just objects desiccated and dead. He paid the small punctures no mind, his thoughts consumed by his failure, by the thirst, by the image of the locket in Blackwood's hand. He slumped against the wall, the strange, musty smell of the crate's contents filling the small space, and finally succumbed to an exhausted, dreamless sleep. He did not feel it when, nourished by the moisture of his blood, something ancient and patient began to stir beneath his skin. The journey back to his farm was a fever dream. He walked for what felt like days, the sun and thirst his constant torturers. When he finally stumbled onto his own property, he was half dead, his skin cracked and burned his mind a haze of pain and regret. He spent the next 2 days in a stupor drinking water until he was sick, his body slowly, painfully knitting itself back together. It was on the 3rd day that he felt it. A faint itching in the palm of his hand where the pods had pricked him. He dismissed it as part of the healing process. But the itch soon became a distinct sensation of movement, a subtle subcutaneous crawling. He watched horrified as small bumps traveled from his wrist toward his elbow, like tiny creatures burrowing under a blanket of flesh. A cold fire began to trace paths along his veins. His first thought was infection from the desert, a fever playing tricks on his mind. But the evidence was undeniable, a visible rippling under his skin. The memory of the shattered jar of the strange thorny cocoons returned with sickening clarity. Margaret's hidden collection. He returned to the small empty farmhouse, his mind racing. He had to know what she had been hiding. What were those specimens? He tore the house apart, his search now fueled by a primal fear that went deeper than his thirst for revenge. He found her journal again, the one he had only skimmed before. He lit a lantern, though it was the middle of the day, and began to read page by agonizing page. The later entries were a descent into a private hell. November 5th. He was back. The man with the cold eyes. His name is Silas Blackwood. He didn't threaten me. He was polite. He spoke of his brother Thomas. He spoke of Jericho's folly. He knows everything. He told me he doesn't want Ethan's life. He wants to own it, to strip it bare until there is nothing left but regret. He will take the farm, the town, everything Ethan has built. He will leave him with nothing but the memory of what he lost. Ethan's hands shook the pages rattling in the quiet room. She had known. She had faced Blackwood herself. He read on his breath catching in his throat. November 21st. I cannot tell Ethan. The guilt would destroy him. He has worked so hard to bury that man, the gunslinger. To see him rise again would be a second death. I must find another way. A way to protect him. December 9th. An old trapper passed through a man named Moreau. He spoke of the deep, northern wilderness of places where nature has its own laws. He told me stories of blights of insects that can lay a man low in hours. He called them highland borers. He said the natives used them in poultices, that they contained strange properties. Healing, he said, and destruction. He brought me specimens, eggs, preserved in a special fluid. He warned me they were dangerous, but I am desperate. The truth hit Ethan with the force of a physical blow. The wasting sickness that had taken her. It hadn't been a sickness at all. He remembered her final months. The fevers, the weakness, the strange marks on her arms she dismissed as rashes. She had been experimenting on herself, trying to understand the parasites, to find a way to turn Blackwood's own scorched earth tactics against him. She wasn't trying to find a cure for an illness. She was trying to forge a weapon to save him. The final entry was almost illegible, her hand shaking violently. January 16th. A mistake. The seal on one jar was weak. I was careless. Something is inside me, moving. A terrible cold. I was wrong. This is not a weapon. It is a curse. I have failed him. Forgive me, my love. Ethan dropped the journal. A low, wretched sound tore from his soul. His grief was no longer a simple, clean thing. It was now horribly complicated by guilt, by the crushing weight of her sacrifice. She had died not from a random act of fate, but from a desperate, misguided act of love, trying to protect him from his own past. And now that same curse was inside him. He looked at his arm. The movement was stronger now, a phantom drumming against his ribs. The cold fire was spreading, moving up his shoulder toward his chest. He was living her final days. The parasites she had unleashed to save him were now consuming him. Blackwood wanted to strip his life bare, and Margaret, in her love, had inadvertently handed him the perfect tool. Ethan Ward was a man haunted by ghosts, hunted by a patient killer, and now he was being eaten alive from the inside out. He was running out of time on every front. He had to get to Dr. Sloan. Dr. Emmett Sloan's office smelled of carbolic acid and old paper, a scent Ethan had always found reassuring. Today it felt like a mortuary. He stood before the doctor, his sleeve rolled up, exposing the inflamed skin of his forearm. The grotesque, undulating movement beneath the surface was impossible to ignore. Dr. Sloan, a man whose professional life was built on logic and observable facts, stared at Ethan's arm, his expression a mixture of clinical fascination and profound disbelief. He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, leaned closer, and pressed his fingers gently against the skin. He flinched, pulling his hand back as if he'd touched a hot stove. Extraordinary, he murmured, his voice a dry whisper. In 30 years of practice, I have never encountered anything of this nature. It feels organized, deliberate. They're parasites, Ethan said, his voice flat. He had already passed through the stages of panic and denial. All that was left was a grim, hollow resolve. From a collection my wife kept, he explained everything: the journal, Margaret's desperate plan, and the shattered jar at the old homestead. He left out the parts about Blackwood and Jericho's folly. To the doctor, this needed to be a medical problem, not a confession. Sloan listened intently, his skepticism slowly giving way to alarm. He was a man of science, but the wildness of the frontier had taught him that the world was far stranger than the textbook suggested. Specimens from the northern wilderness, he said, stroking his chin. I've read accounts from explorers. Tales of flora and fauna that defy classification. If these borers, as you call them, have been dormant for years and have now hatched inside you. He trailed off, peering at Ethan over the rim of his glasses. Mr. Ward, we are in uncharted territory. He retrieved a magnifying glass and a surgical probe. I need to examine this more closely. There appears to be a significant infestation. Through the lens, the skin seemed to stretch and contract in tiny rhythmic patterns. A phantom drumming against his ribs, Ethan thought. That's what it felt like. What does that mean? Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. It means something living has taken up residence in your tissue, the doctor said grimly. And based on the speed of their travel, they are feeding and growing at an alarming rate. Suddenly the movement stopped. The rippling ceased. The silence in his arm was more terrifying than the activity had been. What's happening? Ethan's voice was tight with fear. Dr. Sloan shook his head, his face pale. In my experience with biology, sudden dormancy often precedes a period of rapid metamorphosis. a next stage of development. He looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with a new dreadful urgency. They may be preparing to burrow deeper, toward your vital organs. As if on cue, a new sensation began. Not movement, but a spreading intense heat, as if a furnace had been lit within his arm. A deep rhythmic pulsing began a sound he could feel more than hear, like tiny heartbeats drumming against the inside of his flesh. Dr. Ethan said, his voice strained with panic. "They're moving toward my heart. We have to get them out," Dr. Sloan said, his professional composure cracking. He grabbed a scalpel, his hand shaking slightly. "I must make an incision. Now." He positioned the blade over the most swollen area near Ethan's shoulder. But before he could cut, the office door swung open. Sheriff Brody stood there, his hand resting on his pistol. His weary eyes took in the scene, Ethan pale and sweating on the examination table, the doctor poised with a scalpel. "Sloan, I need a word," the sheriff said, his gaze lingering on Ethan. "One of Blackwood's men was just found dead a mile outside of town, shot in the back. Another one of his boys came riding and claims it was Ward here. Says he saw him running from the scene." Ethan felt the trap snap shut. Blackwood wasn't just hunting him. He was framing him. He was turning the law, the entire town, against him. "That's a lie," Ethan said, trying to push himself up. But a wave of dizziness and heat washed over him. The pulsing in his chest was stronger, a frantic, desperate rhythm. Maybe the sheriff said, his expression unreadable. "But right now, you're a man with a motive and no alibi. I'm going to have to ask you to come with me, Ward." "Sheriff, you don't understand," Dr. Sloan interjected, gesturing with the scalpel. "This man needs immediate medical attention. He's infested." Brody's eyes narrowed. He looked from the doctor's wild expression to Ethan's ghastly pallor and the visible throbbing in his shoulder. "Infested with what guilt?" "No, with parasites," Sloan insisted. "Look." The sheriff stepped closer, his skepticism plain on his face. He stared at Ethan's arm. The skin was now a mottled red, and a vein near his collarbone pulsed in a sickening, unnatural rhythm. Brody had seen men die of snakebite, cholera, and gunshot wounds, but he had never seen anything like this. "Whatever that is," the sheriff said slowly, "it can wait. Murder can't. He'll be dead in hours," the doctor cried out. "These things are moving toward his heart." Ethan knew he had no choice. Brody was a good man, but he was a man of the law, and the law moved too slowly. Blackwood knew that. He had weaponized the town's justice just as surely as Margaret had tried to weaponize the parasites. With a surge of adrenaline that momentarily cleared his head, Ethan lunged. He shoved past the startled doctor, knocked the sheriff off balance, and burst out of the office. He clattered down the wooden stairs and into the street, his body on fire, the tiny hearts inside him beating a frantic tattoo of his own impending death. He had to run. He was now a fugitive from the law, a vessel for a biological horror, and a target for a killer who was methodically erasing his entire world. He ran for the livery, his only thought to get his horse and disappear into the wilderness. He was being hunted from without and consumed from within. The race had begun. The wilderness became his only sanctuary, a harsh and unforgiving haven. Ethan pushed his horse relentlessly, heading for the high country, a maze of canyons and pine forests where a man could disappear. The pulsing in his chest was a constant, terrifying companion, a clock ticking down the moments he had left. The heat radiating from within him was so intense it felt like he might spontaneously combust. He rode until his horse was lathered and trembling. And then he dismounted and continued on foot, scrambling up scree slopes and through thorny thickets. He was a man possessed, driven by the twin engines of survival and vengeance. He had to stay alive long enough to clear his name, long enough to face Blackwood one last time, long enough to reclaim the locket. He made a cold camp in a rock overhang as night fell, shivering despite the fire raging in his blood. He had no food, and the water in his canteen was nearly gone. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret's face from the journal's last entry, her eyes filled with love and terror. He felt a phantom itching all over his body, the sensation of millions of tiny legs crawling just beneath his skin. He was becoming a tomb, a walking grave. He grew weaker. The world began to swim at the edges, his vision blurring. He knew he didn't have much time. He couldn't outrun the enemy that was already inside him. In a moment of desperate clarity, he realized there was only one path left. He couldn't fight Blackwood and the parasites at the same time. He had to choose, and the choice was obvious. He had to go back. Back to Dr. Sloan. He stumbled back into redemption under the cover of darkness, a ghost slipping through the alleys he had once walked as a respected neighbor. He was gaunt, feverish, his clothes torn. He avoided the main street and the sheriff's office, making his way to the back of the general store to the private entrance that led to Dr. Sloan's residence. He prayed the doctor was alone. He tapped weakly on the door. After a long moment, a light appeared, and the door opened a crack. Dr. Sloan's face appeared etched with worry. When he saw Ethan, his eyes widened in alarm. "Good heavens, man, you look like death itself," he whispered, pulling Ethan inside and bolting the door. "The sheriff has a posse looking for you." "I know," Ethan rasped, collapsing into a chair. "But I had nowhere else to go." "It's worse, Doc. Much worse." He tore open his shirt. The skin on his chest and shoulder was a grotesque canvas of red and purple, the veins swollen and dark. The pulsing was no longer subtle. It was a visible rhythmic contraction of the muscles, as if his entire upper body were a single giant beating heart. Dr. Sloan stared, his scientific curiosity overwhelmed by sheer horror. "They've established colonies," he breathed. "My God, they've integrated with your pectoral muscles? They're drawing directly from the major arteries. Can you do anything?" Ethan pleaded, his voice cracking. The doctor's face was a grim mask. "Standard surgery is out of the question. They're too enmeshed with your circulatory system. To cut them out now would be to kill you instantly, from blood loss." He began to pace the room, his mind racing. There has to be another way. An agent. Something that could kill them without killing you. He stopped, his eyes lighting on a small glass-fronted cabinet. "Wait. Margaret. You said she was experimenting, trying to find a weapon." "She was," Ethan said. "It's what killed her." "Yes, but what was she trying to create?" "Not just the parasites themselves. A delivery system, an antidote." Sloan rummaged through a stack of medical journals on his desk. "She sent me a letter months before she passed. A scientific query. It seemed eccentric at the time. She asked about the properties of carbolic acid not as an antiseptic, but as a poison when introduced to invertebrate biology. And something else. Oil of wintergreen." He pulled out a dusty bottle from the cabinet. "It's a powerful counter-irritant. In high concentrations, it's toxic." Perhaps she theorized that a combination could be injected directly into the creatures. It was a wild, desperate gamble. An untested theory from a dying woman's frantic research. "It could kill you," Dr. Sloan warned, his hand hovering over the bottle. "The shock to your system might stop your heart." "It's already stopping," Ethan said, clutching his chest as a wave of pain washed over him. "Do it." As Sloan began preparing a strange, volatile mixture in a large syringe, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the street outside. Then, a firm, authoritative knock on the front door of the general store, downstairs. "Sloan." It was Sheriff Brody's voice. "I know you're in there. I have men surrounding the building. Send word out now." Dr. Sloan froze the syringe in his hand. They were trapped. The law on one side, a relentless killer on the other, and a biological time bomb ticking away inside Ethan's chest. The storm that had begun in the Redemption Bank was about to break, and Ethan Ward was standing at its violent, inescapable center. The saloon doors swung open, not with a boisterous shove, but with a slow, deliberate push that silenced the nervous chatter within. The wind howled outside, a physical manifestation of the town's terror, driving a fresh wave of dust through the streets. Silas Blackwood stepped inside, flanked by his 2 remaining gunmen. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who owned the world and everything in it. He took in the scene, Ethan pale and trembling, but standing. Dr. Sloan holding the strange large syringe like a weapon. Sheriff Brody, his hand hovering over his holstered pistol. A town meeting. Blackwood observed, his voice dripping with amusement. He removed his gloves with meticulous care. How quaint. "Sheriff, I trust you're here to arrest this murderer. I'm here to see justice done." Blackwood Brody said, his voice steady despite the odds. One way or another, Blackwood's gaze settled on Ethan, a cold fire burning in his eyes. "Justice," he repeated softly. "You know nothing of the word. 10 years ago, this man murdered my brother in a dusty street over nothing. He shot him down and walked away without a backward glance. I was there. I watched the life leave my brother's eyes while this farmer cleaned his gun." The confession hung in the air, thick and heavy as the dust. The few remaining townspeople in the saloon stared, their fear now mixed with a dawning understanding. "That's not what happened." Ethan's voice was a ragged whisper, but it carried across the room. "Your brother was drunk and arrogant. He drew on me." "A convenient story," Blackwood sneered. "But his life was still forfeit. A debt was incurred. And I am here to collect. I have taken your land, your reputation, and soon your life. But first," he reached into his waistcoat, "I will take the last thing you hold dear." He produced the silver locket. He held it up, letting it catch the flickering lantern light. "I know what your wife tried to do." Ward Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She was a formidable woman. She came to me, you know, before the sickness took her. She offered me everything, the farm, all your money, if I would only leave you in peace." The words struck Ethan harder than any physical blow. Margaret facing this monster, trying to bargain for his life, while he remained blissfully ignorant. "I refused, of course," Blackwood continued, his cruelty absolute. "I did not want your money. I wanted your despair. I told her what I would do to you, how I would peel away your life layer by layer. It seems the thought distressed her. It must have been what drove her to such desperate, foolish measures with her little pets." He smiled, a final triumphant twist of the knife. "In the end, you see, you killed her as surely as you killed my brother." Something inside Ethan snapped. It wasn't just rage. It was a clarity born of absolute loss. He was already a dead man. The parasites were afire in his veins. The law was at his back, and his past had finally caught and consumed him. A dead man had nothing left to lose. "Doc," he said, his eyes never leaving Blackwood. "Now." Before anyone could react, Dr. Sloan plunged the large syringe deep into the pulsing mass on Ethan's shoulder. An unearthly scream was torn from Ethan's throat as the chemical fire of the injection met the biological fire of the parasites. His body convulsed, his legs buckling. The pulsing in his chest went into a frantic, chaotic spasm, and then, with a sickening finality, it stopped. The silence in his body was absolute. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You've saved me the bullet." But Ethan was not dead. He pushed himself back to his feet, his body screaming in agony, but his eyes were clear. The internal fire was gone, replaced by a chilling, numbing cold. But he was free. He was his own man again. In that moment, the world erupted into a cacophony of violence. Ethan lunged for a table, overturning it for cover, just as Blackwood's men opened fire. Splinters flew as bullets tore through the wood. Sheriff Brody drew his weapon, his first shot taking one of the gunmen in the shoulder, sending him spinning. Dr. Sloan, a man of healing turned warrior, hurled a heavy whiskey bottle that shattered against the other gunman's head as dazing him. Ethan scooped up a fallen deputy's pistol. He rose from behind the table, a specter of vengeance. The world had narrowed to a single point, Silas Blackwood. Blackwood fired the bullet, searing a hot line across Ethan's ribs. Ethan barely felt it. He aimed and fired, his hand steady, the muscle memory of 1,000 gunfights returning in a flood. His shot was true. It struck the locket in Blackwood's hand, the impact sending it flying across the room where it skittered under the piano. Blackwood cried out, more in shock than pain, staring at his numb fingers. It was the opening Ethan needed. He fired again. The bullet caught Blackwood in the chest, throwing him backward against the bar. He slid to the floor, a look of utter disbelief on his face. The fight was over. One gunman was down, the other surrendering to Brody. The saloon was a wreck of shattered glass and splintered wood, and the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Ethan staggered toward the piano, his body a map of pain. He dropped to his knees and reached underneath his fingers, closing around the cool, familiar shape of the silver locket. It was dented, the front scarred by the bullet that had saved it, but it was whole. He clutched it in his fist, a final painful piece of his reclaimed life. He had faced his past, survived his own body's betrayal, and stared into the abyss of his enemy's hatred. The storm at last was over. The clearing of the storm left behind a world that felt newborn. The dust settled, revealing a sky of impossible clarity. The air in Redemption was clean, sharp, and blessedly still. In the aftermath of the saloon showdown, the town slowly, tentatively came back to life. Silas Blackwood was dead. His gang, broken and leaderless, was rounded up by Sheriff Brody and a hastily formed posse of townsfolk who had found their courage in the silence after the final gunshot. The siege was over. Ethan lay on Dr. Sloan's examination table, drifting in and out of a painful, exhausted consciousness. The doctor worked tirelessly, cleaning and stitching the gunshot wound on his ribs, his face a mask of grim concentration. But his primary focus was on the aftermath of the injection. The parasites are dead. Sloan confirmed, his voice filled with a kind of weary awe as he probed the now still flesh of Ethan's shoulder. The mixture created a massive systemic shock. It killed them instantly. It nearly killed you too. He shook his head. I have no medical explanation for how you survived, Ethan. Willpower, perhaps. Or just plain stubbornness. Ethan managed a weak smile. He owed me a debt. Sheriff Brody entered the room, his hat in his hands. He looked from the doctor to Ethan, his weary eyes holding a newfound respect. The town council held an emergency meeting, he said. All charges against you have been dropped. Blackwood's surviving man confessed everything to frame up the vendetta. Seems you're a hero. The word felt hollow, alien. Ethan was no hero. He was just a man who had run out of room to run. What about the locket? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Brody placed it on the small table beside the bed. The silver was scarred, the portrait of Margaret inside miraculously unharmed. It's safe, the sheriff said. He cleared his throat, a rare moment of discomfort on his weathered face. What Blackwood said about your wife? I'm sorry you had to hear that. Ethan simply nodded, clutching the locket in his hand. The truth of her sacrifice was a painful, beautiful burden he would carry forever. He had spent years trying to bury his past, to protect her from it, while all along she had been trying to protect him. His recovery was slow. The toxins released by the dying parasites left him weak, and his body had to heal from the violence inflicted both from within and without. Dr. Sloan watched over him, documenting the unprecedented case with a meticulousness that bordered on obsession. The town of Redemption, once a place of quiet exile for Ethan, became a community. People brought him food. They offered to tend his fields. They had seen the monster he had faced down for them, and they offered their quiet, sturdy gratitude in return. They had redeemed him in their eyes, and in doing so allowed him to begin redeeming himself. Weeks later, the sun rose on a quiet, cool morning. The desert air was sweet with the scent of sage. Ethan Ward, his body scarred, but whole, saddled his horse. He was no longer gaunt, and the hollows in his cheeks filled out the haunted look in his eyes, replaced by a deep, quiet calm. He rode out from the town, not east toward the mountains of his past, but west toward the small fenced-off cemetery on a low hill overlooking his farm. He stood before Margaret's grave, the simple wooden cross a stark silhouette against the vast blue sky. For 2 years, this place had been a monument to his grief and guilt. He had come here seeking a forgiveness he never felt he deserved. He took the silver locket from his pocket. The dent from the bullet was a permanent scar, a reminder of the battle fought for its return. He did not open it. He knew the face inside. He knew the love it represented. With a quiet reverence, he hung the locket over the crosspiece of the grave marker, the silver chain glinting in the morning sun. It was not an offering or a goodbye. It was an acceptance. He was finally letting her go, not from his memory, but from the prison of his regret. Her sacrifice had not been in vain. She had saved him not just from Blackwood, but from the ghost of Jericho's folly, the ghost he had been fleeing his entire adult life. He stood there for a long time as the sun climbed higher, feeling the warmth on his face. The phantoms were gone. The drumming in his blood was silenced. The past was no longer a predator hunting him, but a quiet story whose final chapter had been written. He had walked through the fire and emerged on the other side, a different man, a whole man. He turned and walked back to his horse, his gaze fixed on the town in the distance, a place that had finally lived up to its name.